The letter hit the floor of the Dusk Creek General Store like a gunshot. Gertrude Bell stood over it, her hands trembling, her dark eyes fixed on the words she had already read 4 times on the train west and twice more on the stagecoach that had rattled her bones for the last 11 hours. She had memorized every syllable of the cruelty contained within it, but she had carried it anyway, the way a person carries a wound they cannot stop touching. The store owner, a heavy-set man named Corbett, was watching her from behind the counter with the particular expression of someone who had already heard the story and was waiting to see if the woman in front of him would crumble beneath the weight of it. She would not crumble. She refused, but her hands would not stop shaking. The letter had been written by a man named Edmund Farr, a prominent banker in Hartford, Connecticut, a man of influence and pressed suits and opinions delivered in the tone of a verdict. He had been engaged to Gertrude for 14 months. He had been intimate with her for 6 of those months, in secret, in the back parlor of her late father's home, with the full understanding between them that marriage was imminent. He had told her she was the only woman he had ever truly loved. He had told her that her intelligence was a rare and beautiful thing. He had told her many things, and then his mother had found out, and then his mother had told her friends. And then half of Hartford had decided that Gertrude Bell, 26 years old, daughter of a deceased schoolteacher, had deliberately seduced Edmund Farr in order to trap him into a union above her station. The story spread with the particular velocity of lies that contain just enough surface truth to avoid easy refutation. Edmund had not corrected a single soul. He had instead written her this letter, ending the engagement, wishing her well in tones so formal they made her stomach turn, and within the week he had announced his engagement to a woman from a family with a summer home on the coast. Gertrude had packed 1 trunk, boarded a westbound train, and left everything she had ever known behind her. She had answered an advertisement in the Hartford Courant. A cattleman in the territory of Colorado needed a schoolteacher for the children of his ranch hands. Room and board provided. A wage of $14 per month. The advertisement had been plain, almost blunt in its lack of poetry, and that bluntness had appealed to her in a way nothing else had in months. She had written back. The cattleman, a man named Micah Ashford of the AA Ranch outside Dusk Creek, Colorado, had replied within 10 days, offering her the position. His letter had been 7 sentences long. None of those sentences had asked about her reputation, her family, her history, or her worth as a woman. They had asked only whether she could manage a class of mixed ages, and whether she had any objection to teaching outdoors when the weather permitted. She had wept over those 7 sentences. She picked the letter off the floor now, Edmund's poison and her past folded together into a neat rectangle she tucked back into her traveling bag. She straightened her back, smoothed the front of her dark green traveling dress and looked up at Corbett. "I am looking for a man named Micah Ashford," she said. "He is the owner of the AA Ranch. Could you tell me the best way to reach him?" Corbett's expression shifted subtly, the wariness replaced by something closer to respect. "Micah Ashford rides in every Tuesday and Thursday for supplies," he said. "Today being Tuesday, he ought to be in within the hour if he's riding to his usual schedule. You're welcome to wait, miss." "I have a chair by the window." Gertrude sat. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the main street of Dusk Creek, Colorado through the dusty glass, and she felt the strange, sharp possibility of a completely different life begin to take shape around her like a country she had not yet learned the language of, but could already feel the warmth of under her feet. She had come west carrying a shame she had not earned. She did not yet know that the man she was about to meet would not care about it at all. Dusk Creek in the spring of 1883 was not a large town, but it was a working one, which Gertrude found more comforting than she expected. She had grown up in Hartford, which was a city of pretensions and parlor furniture and the careful maintenance of appearances, and the honest functionality of this raw little western town felt like fresh air entering a room that had been closed for too long. There was a livery stable and a hotel, and a doctor's office and 2 saloons, a small white-painted church, and a telegraph office that also served as a newspaper, where a young man in a paper hat was setting type by hand in the window. The street was packed dirt, still damp from rain 2 days prior, and a pair of cowboys were arguing cheerfully outside the saloon about something involving a horse. It was nothing like Hartford. It felt inexplicably like relief. She had been sitting for 40 minutes, watching the town and letting Corbett's wife, a small, efficient woman named Ruth, press a cup of coffee and a slice of dried apple pie on her, when she heard the particular sound of a man who moves with purpose. Boots on the board walk, quick and certain, not careless but not hesitant either. The door of the general store opened, and the man who walked through it was not what she had pictured when she read his 7-sentence letter. She had pictured someone older. She had pictured weathered and bowed. Micah Ashford was 32 years old, tall but not extravagantly so, with the kind of physical presence that comes not from size but from a person who has spent years making definite decisions. He was lean from work, with broad shoulders under a faded blue shirt, dark brown hair that needed cutting by about 3 weeks, and a face that was honest rather than handsome, all strong jaw and direct, eyes the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between gray and green, and entirely too watchful to be careless. He had a hat in his hand, not on his head, which told her something about his upbringing, and he moved through the store with the easy familiarity of a man who knew exactly where everything was. He saw her before she fully stood, and he stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a theatrical one. Simply the pause of a man who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it with honesty. "Miss Bell," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she replied, and found to her surprise that her voice did not shake. He crossed the store in 4 strides and extended his hand, and she shook it the way a colleague would shake a hand firmly, without the limp and delicate offering that was expected of women in the social circles she had left behind. His grip was warm and calloused, and he did not crush her fingers. "I expected you on Monday's stage," he said. Not an accusation, just a statement. "The stage out of Pueblo was delayed," she said. "An axle. I sent a telegraph, but I suspect it arrived after you had already made the journey once. I rode in yesterday and Corbett told me nothing had come in," he agreed. He glanced at her trunk, visible through the window propped against the outside wall of the store. "You have luggage." "1 trunk," she said. "I travel light." Something moved across his face at that, something she could not quite read, a flicker of assessment that was not unkind but was absolutely honest. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a situation he is trying to understand completely before committing to an interpretation of it. "I have a wagon," he said, "if you're ready to ride out." "I have been ready for considerably longer than today," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He almost smiled. Not a full smile, not yet, but the edge of one, the architectural beginning of a smile in the way the corner of his mouth moved and the lines near his eyes shifted. "All right then, Miss Bell," he said. "Let's go." The ride out to the Double-A Ranch took just over 2 hours, following a trail that cut north through rolling grassland where the spring had just barely arrived, the new grass coming in pale and tentative between last year's gray stalks. The sky was enormous in a way that never ceased to be slightly alarming to someone who had grown up under the compressed sky of a New England city, a deep blue bowl pressing down on the world from every direction at once, and Gertrude kept looking up at it with a feeling she could only describe as vertigo of the soul. Micah drove the wagon with the same quiet efficiency with which he seemed to do everything. He was not much for idle talk, she discovered, but he was not cold either. He answered her questions about the ranch in complete and informative sentences. He pointed out landmarks, a red rock formation to the northwest that he called the Fingers, a creek line visible by its cottonwoods 2 miles east. He told her that there were currently 9 children on the ranch in need of schooling, ranging in age from 5 to 14, belonging to 4 different families of ranch hands, and that he had set aside a room in the bunkhouse annex for a schoolroom. "Where will I be staying?" she asked. "The main house has a guest room," he said. It has its own door to the outside and its own bolt from the inside. If that does not suit you, Hector Salinas and his wife Maria have an extra room they offered." She considered this. "The main house will suit me fine," she said. "I am not fragile, Mr. Ashford." "I did not imagine you were," he said, and this time the almost smile became a definite, if brief, actual smile. "I mentioned the bolt because I thought you would want to know about it, not because I was warning you about anything." She felt the heat of a blush she did not want, rising up from her collarbone. "I appreciate the information," she said crisply. He let the silence rest between them then, easy and unremarkable, the way a man lets a fire settle rather than constantly poking at it. And Gertrude found herself unexpectedly grateful for the lack of interrogation. Every person she had spoken to in the months since Edmund's letter had asked questions. Some had asked them with cruelty, and some with sympathy, and some with the particular invasive curiosity of people who want a story to carry away, but every single one of them had asked. The silence of this man and this landscape was like a hand placed gently over a wound. The Double-A Ranch came into view around a bend in the trail, and it was larger than she had expected. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from timber and adobe, with a wide front porch running the full length of the facade, painted white on the trim, though the paint needed freshening. Behind it spread a complex of working buildings, a large barn with red paint nearly weathered to pink, a bunkhouse, several smaller structures she could not yet identify, and beyond all of it the pastures where cattle grazed in the long afternoon light, hundreds of them, red and brown and black, moving slowly across the grass in the unhurried way of animals that have never heard of urgency. It was a real place, was her first thought, a place that existed for reasons beyond appearances. A place that worked. A brown-skinned woman came out of the main house as Micah drew the wagon to a stop, wiping her hands on her apron, and she looked at Gertrude with dark, curious eyes and a direct expression that Gertrude immediately liked. "Miss Bell," Micah said, "this is Maria Salinas. She keeps this house from falling into chaos." Maria Salinas's eyes crinkled at the corners. "He means I cook," she said, and her English had the particular music of a woman who had been speaking two languages her whole life. "You must be hungry and tired. Come inside. There is stew and cornbread." Gertrude climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance and extended her hand to Maria as she had to Micah. Maria shook it, looked down at it, looked back up at Gertrude's face, and nodded once in a way that seemed to settle something. "I will show you your room," Maria said. "Micah, her trunk." Micah, without objection, lifted the trunk from the wagon. Her room was at the far end of the upstairs hallway, as described, with its own exterior door opening onto a small second-floor balcony that looked out over the eastern pastures. There was a bed with a proper iron frame and a wool quilt in blues and greens, a writing table, a wardrobe, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and on the table, a small vase with a single spray of early wildflowers, purple and white, that she did not think had been placed there by accident but did not know how to ask about. That night she ate stew and cornbread at the kitchen table with Maria and Maria's husband Hector, a quiet, dignified man who worked as Micah's foreman and spoke in measured, precise sentences. Micah ate with them, which she had not expected, and the conversation covered practical things, the schedule for school, the names and ages of the children, which families they belonged to. There were the Salinas children, 2 boys aged 8 and 11. There were 3 children belonging to a ranch hand named Pete Overton and his wife Clara, a girl of 14 and twins of 7. There were 2 children of a young cowboy named Dewey Martin, boys of 5 and 9, whose mother had died of influenza the previous winter. And there were 2 daughters of Micah's own, cousins placed in his care 3 years prior when their parents had died of fever, girls named Cora and Bess, aged 10 and 12. This last piece of information surprised her. "They are your cousin's children?" she asked. "My cousin Thomas and his wife Alina," he said. "They died within 2 weeks of each other. The girls had nowhere else to go. He said it plainly, without the heroic coloring that a man seeking admiration would have applied to it. He said it the way a person states a simple fact about the world. There was a need, and he met it. Gertrude looked at her stew and felt something shift inside her chest. She met the children the following morning. They filed into the newly arranged schoolroom in the bunkhouse annex, with the varying degrees of enthusiasm she expected from children asked to enter a classroom on a fine spring morning. Cora and Bess Ashford were solemn, dark-eyed girls with their uncle's watchful quality, and a wariness toward Gertrude that she recognized as the wariness of children who had lost people, and were not yet sure whether new people were safe to attach to. She treated it with the same patience she would have applied to any wounded creature, which was to say gently and without forcing it. The Overton girl, who was 14 and named Abigail, was bright and sharp and nearly impossible to challenge at the appropriate level, which told Gertrude something important about the previous lack of educational opportunity in this child's life. She began privately planning a more advanced curriculum for Abigail before the first morning was over. The youngest, Dewey Martin's 5-year-old, was named Sam, and he fell asleep in his chair after lunch and had to be carried back to the bunkhouse by his brother, a 9-year-old named Patrick, who had taken on an air of gentle responsibility that no 9-year-old should have had to carry but was carrying admirably. She taught them reading and arithmetic and geography, and because she believed firmly that the world was larger than a single story, she taught them a little history that included the truth of what had happened to the peoples who had lived on this land before the ranches and the towns. Hector Salinas, who sometimes stood in the doorway of the schoolroom during the history lessons, watched her with an expression she came to understand over time was not suspicion, but a kind of careful gratitude. She did not see much of Micah in those first weeks, which was entirely appropriate, and also, she admitted to herself late at night in the blue and green room with the wildflowers periodically replaced on her table, a source of a complicated and unwelcome feeling. He rose before dawn. He worked until dusk. He was polite and direct and entirely professional in his interactions with her, and he was also, she had concluded against her better intentions, one of the most quietly compelling people she had ever met. It was not that he was charming. He was not charming in the way Edmund had been charming, that practiced, effortless seduction of rooms full of people. He was something different. He was honest in a way that made charm seem like a lesser currency. When he said something, it was because he meant it. When he did not speak, it was because he had nothing that needed saying. She had grown up in a world of men who performed their emotions for audiences, and she had not understood until now how exhausting she had found it, how much of her own energy had gone into interpreting the performance rather than simply receiving the truth. The trouble with a man who tells the truth, she was discovering, is that you cannot dismiss the things he says as performance. One evening 6 weeks after her arrival, she was sitting on the front porch in the last of the light, reading a geology text she had borrowed from the small shelf of books in Micah's study after he had specifically told her to borrow anything she liked from it, when he came and sat in the other porch chair without preamble or invitation. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he had brought out, set one on the porch rail nearest to her, and opened his own book, a territorial land management document by the look of it, and began to read. She looked at him over the top of her geology text. He did not look up. She went back to her reading. After perhaps 20 minutes of companionable silence, she said, "May I ask you something direct?" He looked up. "Go ahead." "Why did you take in Cora and Bess?" He considered this for a moment. "I told you they had nowhere to go." "I know what you told me," she said. "I am asking why you specifically. Your cousin must have had other family." "Thomas had a brother who did not want the complication," he said. Eleanor's family offered to split the girls up and send them to separate households in different states. I decided that was not going to happen. She studied him. That was a significant thing to take on alone. "Less significant than the alternative for them," he said, and went back to his document. She went back to her book, but the words had stopped registering because she was thinking about a man who had decided, without apparent deliberation, that two little girls would not be separated from each other, not because it was convenient for him, not because it won him admiration, but simply because it was the right thing. She was thinking about the difference between that man and the man who had written her a letter with 7 formal sentences, ending 14 months and considerable intimacy, as though it were a business arrangement concluding at term. The night insects were beginning their noise in the grass beyond the porch. The sky was going purple and orange in the west. "You knew I was coming," she said. "You knew before I arrived. Did anyone tell you anything about why I left Hartford?" The pause was brief, but it was there. "Corbett has a cousin in Hartford," he said carefully. She closed her book. Her hands were steady. "And what did Corbett's cousin tell him?" "Something he told me," Micah said. "Something I decided before you arrived was not my business." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. No evasion, no performance, no carefully managed expression, just his direct gray-green gaze and the complete truth of what he had said. "You did not think it was relevant to my qualifications as a teacher," she said, and it came out flatter than she intended because she was fighting the tightness in her throat. "No," he said, "I did not." She stood up and picked up her coffee cup and her book. "Good night, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Good night, Miss Bell," he replied. She went inside and stood in the hallway with her back against the wall, and her hand pressed over her chest, where the tightness had become something that was not entirely pain. The summer came to the Colorado Territory with a swift and particular violence, the temperature climbing from warm to hot in the space of 2 weeks, the grass turning gold, the sky going white at the horizon with the particular bleached quality of a high plains summer. Gertrude adapted. She opened the schoolroom windows and let the breeze through. She moved the afternoon lessons to the shade of the cottonwood grove near the creek. She began wearing her lighter dresses and letting her dark hair down at the temples instead of pinning every strand. And she discovered that the children learned better when they were not sweltering, which had never been a consideration in Hartford, where the school was a building. She also began to know the ranch and its people. She knew Maria Salinas as a woman of tremendous competence and an equally tremendous capacity for directness, who never said anything she did not mean and never left anything important unsaid. Maria had grown up in New Mexico Territory in a family that had been on that land for 6 generations before any American flag had flown over it. And she had married Hector and moved north to Colorado with a clear-eyed understanding of what that world expected of people who looked like her and spoke 2 languages and carried a history the surrounding society found inconvenient. She and Gertrude came, over the summer, to an understanding that went beyond employer and employee and approached something that both women were careful with and both women valued. She knew Hector Salinas as a man who managed the enormous complexity of running a working cattle ranch with the particular skill of someone who has never had the luxury of being wrong. He was 41, compact and precise, and the cowboys who worked under him did so without resentment because he was always fair and almost always right. She knew the cowboys themselves, 4 permanent hands and additional seasonal workers who came through during Roundup, men of varying backgrounds and varying degrees of literacy, who she was quietly beginning to teach on Wednesday evenings in the schoolroom, an arrangement she had made with Hector first and then mentioned to Micah, who had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read and then said simply, "Good." She knew Pete Overton, who was loud and generous and told tall tales with the enthusiasm of a man who believed that the world needed more entertainment. She knew Clara Overton, who was quiet and competent and perpetually worried about her eldest daughter Abigail, who was too smart for her situation and knew it. She knew Dewey Martin, who was 23 and had lost his wife 8 months ago and was still moving through the world with the stunned quality of a man who has walked into a wall he did not see. She was careful with Dewey Martin because she recognized the look of someone carrying a grief that had not yet found its shape. She knew the two Ashford girls, Cora and Bess, incrementally and carefully. Bess, the elder at 12, was the one who spoke first, as older sisters often do, testing the new person on behalf of the younger. One afternoon in late June, Bess came to Gertrude's room and stood in the doorway and said without preamble, "Did you leave because of something bad that happened to you?" Gertrude set down her pen and looked at the child. "Yes," she said. Bess considered this. "Uncle Micah left Missouri because of something bad that happened to him too," she said. "He never talks about it, but he is fine now." Gertrude filed this information with care. "What makes you say he is fine?" "Because he planted those flowers," Bess said, with the particular logic of a child who has reached a conclusion by means she cannot fully articulate. "On your table. He picked them himself the morning before you came." Gertrude looked at the small vase of wildflowers on her writing table, replaced each week since her arrival, and felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. She did not ask Micah about Missouri. She did not ask about the flowers, but she thought about both with a frequency that was becoming inconvenient. It was Abigail Overton who told her the story of Micah and Missouri, partly, in the fragmented way that ranch gossip travels. 3 weeks later, when she and Gertrude were sitting under the cottonwoods, working through a problem in advanced arithmetic that Abigail had set herself as a challenge. "My father says Mr. Ashford had a woman back in Missouri," Abigail said, with the studied casualness of someone trying to seem less interested than they are. "He says she threw him over for a man with more money, and that's why Mr. Ashford came west and started the ranch." "That is a private matter," Gertrude said, not looking up from the arithmetic. "I know," Abigail said. "I am just telling you what I heard, because I think you ought to know he is not the kind of person who does things for bad reasons." "That is what my mother says. She says he does not have bad reasons in him." Gertrude looked at the 15-year-old girl who had the observational gifts and the social intelligence of a woman twice her age. "Finish the problem," she said. Abigail grinned and finished the problem. That evening, as had become their custom without either of them explicitly arranging it, Gertrude and Micah sat on the front porch in the cooling dark after supper. She had stopped calling him Mr. Ashford in the 3rd week of summer. He had stopped calling her Miss Bell in the 4th. The informality had arrived without negotiation, as natural things tend to. "Tell me about Missouri," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to simply not answer, which was his right, and she was already framing the sentence with which she would withdraw the question when he said, "What do you already know?" "A woman," she said, "someone who chose someone else." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Her name was Catherine Voss," he said. "We were engaged for 8 months. She left for a man named Prescott who owned a mining concern and 400 acres outside St. Louis. I do not blame her for it. She wanted a different life than I was offering." "Did she tell you that honestly?" "No," he said. "She let me find out from someone else." Gertrude nodded slowly. "That is the part that stays with you," she said. "Not the leaving, the way the truth was withheld." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly the part." The silence between them was different now, weighted differently, carrying the particular gravity of two people who have shared something true. The stars above the Colorado plains were extraordinary, the sky so clear and so dark that the Milky Way was a visible smear of light from one horizon to the other, and Gertrude looked up at it with the feeling of a person who is slightly afraid of what they are beginning to want. "I should tell you about Hartford," she said. "You do not have to," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I want to." He waited. She told him. She told him about Edmund Farr, the banker's son with his pressed suits and his practice compliments. The 14 months of an engagement she had genuinely believed was real. The 6 months of intimacy she had genuinely believed was love. She told him about Edmund's mother and the story that had spread through Hartford and the way Edmund had not corrected it, had in fact allowed it to solidify and harden into the foundation of his new engagement, while Gertrude carried the weight of a reputation she had not built. She told him about the letter with its 7 formal sentences, not Micah's 7 sentences which had been decent and clear, but Edmund's 7 sentences which had been a coward's instrument. She told him about packing one trunk, about the advertisement in the Quran, about reading his reply and weeping over the absence of invasive questions. She told him all of it. She told him with her spine straight and her voice steady and her hands folded in her lap, because she was done apologizing for something that was not her fault, and she was done softening truth to make it easier for other people to receive. When she was finished, Micah Ashford set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a long time. He was a coward, he said finally, and the people who believed the worst version were eager to believe it because it confirmed something they already wanted to think. None of that reflects a single thing about your character. I know that, she said, and her voice broke slightly on the last word despite herself. He looked at her with those clear, water-colored eyes, and what was in them was not pity. It was not the careful performance of sympathy. It was simply recognition, the look of a person who has been inside a version of the same darkness and knows the specific weight of it. You built something here, he said. In 6 weeks you made 9 children want to come to school. You started teaching 4 grown men to read on Wednesday nights, and you have not once, in all of it, looked like someone who thinks she owes the world an apology for existing. She pressed her lips together hard. That is because I do not practice the apology outwardly, she said. I have been rehearsing it internally at considerable volume. He stood up and she thought for a moment he was going to say good night and go inside, and the loss of the conversation yawned open briefly before her. Instead he extended his hand. She looked at it. Walk, he said simply. The stars are better from the east pasture. She took his hand and stood, and he let go the moment she was on her feet, which was both correct and a very small disappointment. They walked together into the dark, following the fence line east, and the stars above them were in fact better from the east pasture, which was higher ground with nothing between the eye and the horizon in any direction. They stood under that enormous sky and talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with Hartford or Missouri, and she discovered that he had read widely, that he was interested in land management and soil science, that he had strong opinions about the territorial government's land allocation policies that were carefully considered rather than reflexive, and that he laughed when something genuinely struck him, with a quick, real quality that was completely at odds with his general economy of expression, and therefore all the more noticeable. She was in trouble, she acknowledged to herself as she walked back to the house. She was in considerable, possibly irreversible trouble. She was also, she admitted, not especially sorry about it. July arrived and with it the complication. His name was Douglas Farrow, and he rode onto the Double-A ranch on a Tuesday morning with 2 other men, and the particular air of someone who expects to be made comfortable. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by the standards of a cattleman on the frontier, which was to say his boots were expensive and his hat was new and he wore a watch chain. He was the owner of the Farrow Spread, which was the largest ranch in the county, 15 miles to the west, and he had known Micah Ashford for 3 years. Gertrude was in the schoolroom when Farrow arrived, but she could see the front yard through the window, and she watched the greeting with the particular attention of a woman who has learned to read the subtext in what men do not say to each other. Micah met Farrow with politeness but not warmth, the handshake of 2 men who have a working relationship rather than a friendly one, and Farrow's eyes traveled the property with a proprietorial interest that he did not attempt to conceal. At supper, Farrow joined them, which was customary hospitality on the range, and he spent the meal asking Gertrude questions of the kind she recognized immediately as the inventory-taking of a man assessing a new piece in a landscape he considers his own. Where was she from? What had brought her west? Was she planning to stay? Did she find Colorado agreeable? Each question was delivered with the surface politeness of social interest and the underlying pressure of something else, something she could not name precisely but felt clearly. Micah, across the table, ate his supper and said little, but she noticed his attention. After supper, when she excused herself and went to check on the children's evening reading, she heard Pharaoh say to Micah, as the door swung partly closed behind her, "Pretty woman. Where'd you find her?" She did not hear Micah's reply. Pharaoh stayed 2 days, conducting some kind of business with Micah that she was not privy to and did not ask about, and he watched her with the open, unguarded appraisal of a man who has never been told that a woman's awareness of being watched matters. On the second evening, he cornered her briefly near the bunkhouse annex and said, with what he likely intended as flattery, that a woman like her was wasted on a schoolroom. She looked at him with the expression she had developed for use in Hartford when men said things they should not have said. "Mr. Pharaoh," she said, "I find the schoolroom to be exactly the right size for what I am doing in it." His eyes narrowed slightly, and then he smiled in the way of a man filing information for future use. "Of course," he said. Pharaoh left the following morning, and the air on the ranch felt cleaner for his absence in a way that several people seemed to notice without commenting on. That evening on the porch, Micah said, without looking up from his book, "Did Pharaoh say something to you?" "Nothing actionable," she said carefully. "Tell me anyway," she told him. When she finished, Micah's jaw was set in a particular way, a small compression that she was learning was his version of controlled anger. "He should not have said that," he said. "No," she agreed. "He should not, but he is not an original type, Mr. Pharaoh. I have met his sort in Hartford in considerably more expensive suits." Micah looked at her then, a direct, held look that was different from his usual assessment. "You are more comfortable here than you were a month ago," he said. She was surprised by the observation, by both its accuracy and the fact that he had been watching closely enough to make it. "I am," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his book, but the word had carried a weight to it that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the evening. The trouble with Douglas Pharaoh did not end with his departure, as she should have anticipated. 3 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon when Micah was riding the far range with Hector, and most of the hands were out, Pharaoh rode back to the AA with one of his men. He came to the schoolroom, where Gertrude was alone, having sent the children home for the day, grading their arithmetic. He stood in the doorway, and the smile on his face was different from the one he had worn at supper. "I did some inquiring," he said, "about you. I wrote to a man in Hartford who knows certain things." Gertrude set down her pen. She was very still. "Did you?" she said. "Interesting woman," Pharaoh said, leaning against the doorframe. "The sort who makes her way in the world with whatever tools are available to her. I can respect that. Micah Ashford is a good man, but he is a naive one. I am not naive, Miss Bell, and I am considerably more prosperous." She stood. She was 5 feet 4 inches and he was 6 feet, and it did not matter at all. "You are suggesting," she said, "that because someone in Hartford told you a lie, you now believe that I would be willing to trade one situation for a better one." "I am suggesting nothing," he said. "I am stating plainly that I find you interesting and that I am a man who gets what he wants." "Then you have perhaps encountered your first exception," she said. "Get out of my schoolroom, Mr. Pharaoh." His expression did something complicated and ugly. "You might want to think about your situation here," he said. "One letter to the right person and your position becomes considerably less comfortable." "My situation," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "is that I am a teacher employed by Micah Ashford and I have done nothing to be ashamed of. And if you write any letters to any persons, I will take it as confirmation of your character rather than evidence of mine. Now, get out of my schoolroom." There was a long moment that had a particular quality she did not like, the held quality of an unstable thing, and then Pharaoh straightened from the doorframe and put on his hat and said something dismissive that she chose not to register, and left. She stood in the empty schoolroom for perhaps 2 minutes after he left, breathing carefully. Then she went and told Maria. Maria listened to the entire account with her arms folded and her expression going progressively darker, and when Gertrude finished, Maria said 3 things in Spanish under her breath that Gertrude did not need to speak Spanish to understand the sentiment of. "Micah needs to know," Maria said. "I know," Gertrude said. He came in from the range at dusk, dusty and tired, and she met him at the barn before he had even fully dismounted. She told him what Pharaoh had said, clearly and completely, without softening it and without drama. She watched his face as she spoke. The compression of his jaw was back. His eyes were very still. "He threatened your position here," Micah said when she was done. "He suggested that a letter to the right person could make things uncomfortable," she said. "I told him that such a letter would tell me about his character rather than mine." Micah dismounted fully and handed his horse's reins to the stable boy. He stood looking at the distance for a moment. "He has been trying to acquire this ranch for 2 years," he said. "He made me 2 offers I refused. He has also been in a long-running boundary dispute with Hector's family over a water access right that goes back 15 years. This is not a man who responds well to the word no." "I did not know that," she said. "I am telling you now," he said. He looked at her directly. "His information about Hartford does not change anything here, Gertrude. Nothing about your position on this ranch, nothing about my opinion of you. I need you to be clear about that." She had been Gertrude to him for 6 weeks. The name in his mouth was still something she had not entirely become accustomed to, but it was also, in this moment, the single most grounding thing she could have heard. "I am clear about it," she said. "Good," he said. "I am going to ride over to the Pharaoh spread tomorrow and have a conversation." She started to say that he did not need to do that on her behalf, and then she stopped, because she recognized that he was not doing it only on her behalf. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because Pharaoh's behavior was not acceptable, and because Micah Ashford was the kind of person who addressed things directly rather than hoping they resolved themselves. "All right," she said. He rode to the Pharaoh spread the next morning and returned by midday. He did not tell her exactly what had been said, but he said succinctly, "It has been addressed." And that was the end of Douglas Pharaoh's involvement in her life on the Double A Ranch. She asked Maria later what she thought had happened. "Micah has a quiet kind of authority," Maria said, rolling dough for that evening's supper. "The kind that does not need to be loud to be real. Men like Pharaoh understand it when they meet it, even if they do not like it." Gertrude thought about the 7 sentences in his letter. "Yes," she said, "I think I understand that." August on the Colorado Range had its own fierce and particular beauty. The mornings were still cool, but the days were scorching. The thunderstorms that rolled in from the mountains to the west were spectacular and fast-moving, building in 30 minutes from clear sky to churning black cloud, and then moving through in 40 minutes of violent rain and lightning before the sky cleared again to an innocent blue. Gertrude learned to watch the western horizon after noon, and she learned to move the outdoor lessons back inside before the first clouds topped the mountains, and she learned that the smell of rain on hot Colorado dust was something she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. In August, she kissed Micah Ashford. It was not planned. Nothing about it was planned, and if she had planned it, she would have found reasons to reconsider it. She was helping him with a broken fence section on the northwest pasture, because she had happened to be walking that way when the fence break was discovered, and she had said simply, "Tell me what to do," and he had, and they had worked together for 2 hours in the afternoon heat with a practical, focused companionship that she had found, over the summer, to be one of the specific pleasures of being around this man. He did not find it strange that she wanted to work alongside him. He did not treat her as decorative or fragile. He handed her the end of the wire and showed her how to stretch and splice it, and worked next to her with the same efficient respect he brought to everything. When the fence was repaired, they stood back and assessed it, and she was close enough to see the sweat at his temple and the satisfaction in his expression, the particular pleasure of a man who has fixed something that was broken, and she looked at his face for 1 second too long, and he turned and looked at her, and the moment had its own specific gravity. She kissed him. 1 step forward and her hands against his chest, and his mouth warm and entirely still for a single surprised second before he kissed her back. And it was nothing like the practiced performance of Edmund's kisses. It was a man being entirely honest with his body, no strategy, no theater, nothing between the feeling and the expression of it, and it was brief, because they were standing in a pasture in full daylight, and when she stepped back he was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, unguarded in a way he almost never was. She could feel the heat in her face that had nothing to do with the sun. "That was not part of my employment contract," she said. His mouth curved. "No," he said, "I apologize if it was inappropriately forward of me." "You can stop apologizing," he said. "I have no objection." She studied him. "You have no objection," she repeated. "None," he said, and there was something in his voice, quiet and certain, that she felt in the center of her chest. They walked back to the ranch in a silence that was charged and entirely different from any silence they had shared before, and that evening on the porch they did not read. They talked until past midnight, quietly, on the darkened porch with the oil lamp turned down low, and she told him things she had not told anyone, and he told her things she did not think he told anyone. And the night was warm and full of stars, and the distance between them in their chairs grew smaller by small increments that neither of them acknowledged aloud. September brought the early hint of fall and the beginning of roundup season, which transformed the Double-A Ranch from its regular working state into something close to organized chaos. Additional cowboys arrived, 23 of them over the course of 2 weeks, from as far as the Wyoming Territory, men Hector had employed in previous years whose faces were known to him. The bunkhouse was full. The kitchen produced meals at a scale that required Maria to draft Gertrude and Clara Overton, and even Abigail into service. And Gertrude discovered that she could, with instruction from Maria, produce a reasonable cowboy bread and a respectable pot of beans. She kept school through roundup, because the children's education did not stop for cattle, and she kept her Wednesday evening reading sessions, which had grown to include 6 men rather than 4, 2 of the roundup hands who had heard about it and asked if they could join. Micah was everywhere during roundup, moving from the working cattle to the planning meetings with Hector to the supply negotiations in town, in constant motion from before dawn to after dark, and she watched him manage the enormous enterprise of it with the feeling of a woman watching something she genuinely admires. He was fair with the hands. He was exacting about the cattle count. He dealt with the minor disasters of roundup, a broken leg on one of the horses, a dispute between 2 cowboys over a poker debt, a water source drying up unexpectedly on the eastern range, with the same level, decisive quality he brought to everything. On the 3rd evening of roundup she brought him coffee in the barn where he was reviewing the cattle count with Hector, and she set it on the workbench beside him without interrupting, and he picked it up without looking away from the ledger, took a sip, and then stopped and looked at her. "You made this," he said. "Not Maria." She raised her eyebrows. "How can you tell?" "Maria makes it stronger," he said, and there was something warm in his eyes, a warmth that was becoming increasingly familiar and increasingly difficult to look at for too long without consequences. "I like yours better." Hector, studying the cattle ledger with intense interest, appeared to be entirely absorbed in the numbers, but the corner of his mouth had moved. Roundup concluded in mid-October with a successful cattle drive to the railhead at Pueblo, which Micah led himself. He was gone 10 days. In those 10 days, she kept the school and managed the household alongside Maria, and helped Cora with a reading difficulty that had been quietly troubling the girl for weeks, and she thought about Micah Ashford with a frequency that was no longer something she could dismiss as simple professional respect. She also wrote a letter, not to anyone in Hartford. To herself, essentially, in her journal, the honest inventory of a woman who had come west carrying a burden that was not hers and had found, in a place she could not have imagined a year ago, something she had not known she was looking for. She wrote about the fear underneath the feeling, the fear that was not about Micah specifically, but about the general project of trusting another person with the interior of yourself after you have been used and discarded. She wrote about Edmund and what his betrayal had cost her, not the reputation. She was clear-eyed enough to know that Hartford's opinion of her was a loss she could bear, but the deeper cost, the cost to her willingness to believe that she was worthy of being loved honestly and well. She wrote, "He already knows the worst of what Hartford says about me, and he planted wildflowers on my table. I do not know what to do with a man like that except to stop running away from him." Micah returned from Pueblo on a Thursday, thinner from the trail and tired in his bones, and she met him at the porch with coffee and a plate of supper she had kept warm, and he sat on the porch steps and ate with the unguarded relief of a very tired person receiving exactly what they need, and she sat on the step above him and listened to him describe the cattle drive, the problems with the rail yard pricing, the quality of the herd, the journey back. When he was done eating, he turned and looked up at her and said, "I thought about you the whole ride back." She was quiet for a moment. "What specifically?" she asked. "Specific thoughts," he said, "not general ones." "That is not an answer," she said. "It's the only one I have that's appropriate on a front porch," he said, and she understood then that the careful man was not going to rush this, was not going to tip any of it into territory that could become something to apologize for later, and she respected that even as she found it deeply frustrating. "Micah," she said. He waited. "I am not fragile," she said. "You know that." "I know it," he agreed. "Then stop treating what is between us as though it needs to be wrapped in cotton wool and stored carefully," she said. "I have been honest with you about who I am and what happened to me. I'm not going to break if you are honest with me about what you are feeling." He was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I do not want to move too fast," he said. "You came here to build something for yourself. I do not want to be something that complicates that." She felt the care in that, the genuine consideration of it, and also the fundamental misunderstanding it contained. "What if," she said carefully, "it is not complicating? What if it is part of the building?" He looked up at her, and what was in his face then was not the usual careful assessment but something raw and direct and entirely without the usual guard, and she thought for a moment that she had broken through to the place where the real man lived beneath all his economy and his honesty and his general refusal to perform. "I would not want to misunderstand that," he said quietly. "You are not misunderstanding it," she said. He reached up and took her hand where it rested on her knee, not urgently, not dramatically, simply and completely, and held it in both of his, and they sat on the front porch of the Double-A Ranch while the Colorado stars came out above them, and neither of them said anything more for a long time because nothing more needed saying. October moved into November and the high plains made themselves known. The temperature dropped in a week from mild to cold. The wind arrived from the north with the particular cutting quality of a wind that has traveled a long way without anything to stop it, and the sky became a lower, more serious thing, gray and purposeful, delivering the first snow in the second week of November with a quiet persistence that coated the ground in white by morning. The school moved fully inside for winter. The outdoor lessons and the creek and the cottonwoods went dormant, and the schoolroom in the bunkhouse annex became a warmer, closer place, a place of lamp light and the smell of the cast iron stove and children who sat closer together than they did in warm weather. Gertrude taught through it with the inventiveness of a woman who had been a schoolteacher in Hartford for 3 years before Edmund's shadow fell across her professional life as well, designing projects and debates and arithmetic competitions that kept 9 children engaged through the short gray days. She and Micah had found a rhythm. It was not a declared thing, it had no formal shape, but it was understood between them and between everyone on the ranch, which was a community small enough that there were no secrets, that they were together in the specific way of 2 people who have chosen each other with their eyes open. He was not demonstrative in public, which was consistent with his general character and with the manners of the time and place, but there were ways in which the choice expressed itself that she recognized and treasured. He deferred to her judgment in matters of the children's welfare without making a performance of it. He saved things to tell her, things that happened during his day that he thought she would find interesting or funny. He had begun making sure that whatever book he was reading had a companion copy somewhere, so that they could discuss it. He fixed the bolt on her room door before winter arrived without her having to ask. She acknowledged to herself with a clarity that was both terrifying and enormous, deeply in love with him. In December, a letter arrived from Hartford. It was not from Edmund. It was from her former colleague, a woman named Frances Aldworth who had been Gertrude's closest friend in Hartford, a school teacher at the same school, a woman who had known Edmund and had watched the catastrophe unfold, and had written Gertrude one careful letter after the departure that had been a delicate balance of sympathy and caution. This letter was not careful. This letter was urgent. Edmund Farr, it said, had defaulted on the bank. The mismanagement that had been rumored for 2 years had finally become fact, and in the course of the investigation that followed, certain things about Edmund's character had been thoroughly and publicly documented. Among these things was the truth about his previous engagement to Gertrude Bell, which Frances had personally provided a counter-account of to anyone in Hartford society who would listen, and which had resulted in a significant shift in the narrative. The woman Hartford had quietly branded a seductress had been publicly repositioned as the abandoned innocent, and Edmund Farr had been positioned as a liar and a coward, which Frances said with some evident satisfaction he thoroughly deserved. The letter ended, "You have nothing to return to, Trudy, but I want you to know that if you chose to, you would return without a mark against your name. Whatever you have found out there, I hope it is good. You have earned it." She read the letter at the kitchen table. Maria watched her face as she read and said nothing, which was the correct response. When she put the letter down, she was aware of a complex and unexpected emotion, something she had not anticipated, which was that she did not want to return to Hartford. Not because the letter was unwelcome, she was grateful for it, grateful to Frances, grateful to have the story corrected. It mattered. It was right that it should be corrected. But she had built something here that had nothing to do with Hartford and everything to do with this place, and these people and this man. And the idea of uprooting herself to return to the site of the original wound was not appealing in any form. She wanted to stay. She told Micah about the letter that evening. He read it when she handed it to him, and he handed it back when he was done, and he said, "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved," she said, "and also entirely certain that it does not change what I want." He looked at her with those clear, direct eyes. "Which is?" She held his gaze. "To stay," she said. "Here." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. "There are things I want to say to you," he said, and his voice was quiet and careful in the particular way of a man who is about to say something he means entirely. "That I have wanted to say for some time. I have been waiting because I did not want you to make any decisions while you were still in the shadow of what Hartford did to you. I wanted to be sure you were on your own ground when I said them." She felt her heart turn over slowly in her chest. "I am on my own ground," she said. "I know," he said. "You have been for some time. It took me a while to stop using your protection as an excuse for my own caution." She smiled. She could not help it. "That is a very honest thing to say." "I am working on saying honest things," he said, and the almost smile was full and real now, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. "Gertrude, I love you. I would like to ask you to marry me when you are ready to be asked. I'm not asking tonight if tonight is not the right time, but I want you to know the question is there." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had met her in a general store and carried her trunk and planted wildflowers on her table and told her that her reputation was not his business. This man who had ridden to the Pharaoh spread to make her safe without being asked. This man who had waited for her ground to be solid before asking for anything that required her to stand on it firmly. "Ask tonight," she said. He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached across the small space between them and touched her face with one work-rough hand, and she covered his hand with both of hers, and the fire in the stove crackled quietly, and the Colorado winter pressed against the windows with its enormous dark weight, and inside the warmth of the kitchen of the Double-A Ranch, two people who had both arrived at this place carrying their private wounds and their private secrets found that the wounds were not the end of the story. The wedding was in March of 1884, because Gertrude said plainly that she was not going to wait longer than that, and Micah said equally plainly that he had no objection to March, and the Colorado winter had just released enough of its grip that the mud in the Dust Creek churchyard had dried to a workable consistency. The church was small and white, and the preacher, a mild and thoughtful man named Reverend Holt, had met Gertrude through the Wednesday evening reading sessions, which had by March grown to 8 regular attendees, and he married them with the sincere approval of a man who has seen both members of a couple and concluded that they are good for each other. Maria Salinas had spent 3 days making the cake, a 4-layer structure that was frankly extraordinary considering the available ingredients and the altitude, and had also, without consulting anyone, made Gertrude a new dress from blue cloth that Gertrude had admired in Corbett's store in February. She stood in it in front of the small mirror in her room, which was about to become their room, and thought that the woman in the mirror looked like herself, not the Hartford version of herself with all its careful management and its apologies, but a truer and more substantial self that had apparently always been there under the weight of other people's stories about her. Cora and Bess stood up with her, Cora and Bess, who had come to her gradually and fully over the winter, who called her Gertrude rather than Miss Bell now, with a warmth in the name that she felt each time they used it. Bess had made her a crown of early spring flowers from the first wildflowers of March, which was not in any way appropriate to a formal wedding ceremony and was therefore perfect. Abigail Overton cried, which surprised everyone including Abigail, who said with some indignation when Pete Overton teased her about it that she was not crying. She had something in her eye, and then cried harder. Hector Salinas stood next to Micah, which was correct, because Hector was the closest thing Micah had to a brother, and he stood there with his usual dignified composure until the moment of the vows when Gertrude and Micah looked at each other and said what they meant and meant what they said. And then Hector also had something very temporary and localized in his eye. Micah Ashford looked at Gertrude Bell across the narrow aisle of the Dust Creek Church, and she looked back at him. And what moved between them in that look had the particular quality of the truth, clear and direct, and entirely without performance. The party afterward went on until nearly midnight, which was unprecedented by the standards of Dust Creek, and involved music provided by one of the roundup cowboys who turned out to play the fiddle with considerable skill, and dancing that moved from the churchyard to the church hall when the wind picked up, and food that Maria and Clara Overton and every woman in Dust Creek had contributed to with the competitive generosity of women who take the feeding of celebrations seriously. Gertrude danced with Micah, and she danced with Hector, and she danced with Dewey Martin, who danced with a cautious care that suggested a man who was beginning, slowly and carefully, to allow himself to be present in a world again, which she was glad of. She danced briefly with both Salinas boys and with Patrick Martin and with the fiddle player when he was briefly replaced by another man, and she watched Micah dance with Cora and Bess, one at a time and then both of them at once in a chaotic 3-person construction that made all 3 of them laugh. She thought, watching that, this is what good looks like. Not perfect. Not the Hartford ideal of a polished and correctly managed life. Just real and warm and honest and full. Their first year of marriage was a working one, as all years on a working cattle ranch are working ones, and she found that she did not mind this. She continued to teach the children and the Wednesday evening reading class, which she had no intention of ending. She took on the ranch's accounts, not as a concession of her independence, but because she genuinely enjoyed the precision of it, and because Micah's bookkeeping, while honest, was not organized in a way that made efficiency easy. He accepted this assistance with the practical gratitude of a man who knows his own limitations, and they fell into a partnership at the bookkeeping table that was an extension of every other partnership they had found their way into. In the fall of 1884, in October, she told him she was expecting a child. He was sitting at the bookkeeping table when she told him, and he went very still, the particular stillness of a person receiving information of enormous import. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was not a performance of joy but the actual thing, unguarded and complete. He stood up and came to her and held her carefully and thoroughly, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt the strong, steady beat of him, and they stayed like that for a long while. The baby was born in June of 1885, in the heat of a Colorado summer morning, with Maria in attendance and Reverend Holt's wife, who had served as midwife for half the county for 20 years. The birth was hard but not dangerous, and at the end of it Gertrude held a boy, a compact, dark-haired, entirely furious boy who announced his presence in the world with the kind of sustained vocal effort that suggested a very strong opinion about having been removed from a comfortable situation. Micah, who had spent 6 hours on the other side of the door learning entirely new definitions of patience, was allowed in, and he held his son with the same careful, complete attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. "Samuel," Gertrude said, watching him. "After my father." "Samuel," Micah agreed, and the name settled. Samuel Ashford was an opinionated and energetic child from his very first weeks, and everyone on the ranch had an opinion about him. Maria held him for the first week at every possible opportunity. Hector regarded him with dignified approval. Cora and Bess, 15 and 13 now, took their role as older cousins with the seriousness it deserved. Dewey Martin's 2 boys, who had essentially adopted the Ashford household as a second home, regarded the new baby with fascinated wariness, and Patrick Martin said, with the considered judgment of an 11-year-old boy, that he was not as loud as Dewey's old horse, but it was close. Abigail Overton, 16 and as sharp as ever, had spent the past year working with Gertrude on advanced mathematics and natural philosophy, and in the spring of 1886 Gertrude wrote, on Abigail's behalf, to a women's college in Denver that had opened its doors in the previous year, and Abigail, with her parents' somewhat bewildered approval, was accepted to study there in the fall. Clara Overton cried. Pete Overton told everyone in Dust Creek about it at considerable volume. Abigail took the news with a composure that lasted approximately 4 minutes before she walked out behind the barn, and according to Cora, who happened to be passing, jumped up and down several times and said something extremely unladylike to the sky. Gertrude wrote the letter of recommendation for Abigail herself, and in it she said that Miss Abigail Overton was the finest student she had ever taught, and that any institution that failed to recognize that was making an error they would regret. She meant every word. In 1887, the Double-A Ranch expanded. Micah purchased 2 sections of adjacent land to the north, partly to expand the grazing and partly to preempt a purchase Pharaoh had been planning, and the expansion required the hiring of additional hands and the building of a new bunkhouse wing. The construction became a community project, with the hands building on their off days and several Dust Creek families contributing labor in the cooperative spirit of the frontier. And when the new bunkhouse wing was dedicated, Micah gave a speech that was 9 sentences long and entirely sincere, and the party afterward was nearly as good as the wedding. That fall, Douglas Pharaoh sold the Pharaoh spread and left the county, having lost a prolonged legal battle over the water rights to a creek that the Salinas family had been using for 20 years. The legal battle had been conducted primarily by Hector, who had hired a territorial lawyer in Denver, and pursued it with quiet, absolute determination for 2 years. When the verdict came in, Hector read it at the kitchen table and put it down and drank his coffee and said nothing. But that evening at supper, he and Micah sat together longer than usual, talking in the quiet way of men who have been in the same country for years and understand each other without much being required in the way of ceremony. Gertrude watched them and thought about alliances, about the kind of loyalty that is built not by drama, but by consistently choosing, over years, to do right. In 1888, Gertrude gave birth to their second child, a girl they named Alina, after Micah's cousin who had died of fever, and whose daughters were now young women of 20 and 18 living their own complex and forward-facing lives. Alina was unlike Samuel in every way, quiet where he was loud, watchful where he was active, and she looked at the world from her first weeks with the particular intensity of a person paying very close attention. Cora Ashford, who was 17 and preparing to leave for Pueblo to work in a school herself, held Alina the afternoon of her birth and looked at her for a long time and said, with a gravity that was entirely her own, "She is going to be something." "She is already something," Gertrude said. "She is going to be more," Cora said, and went back to the book she had been reading, which was a volume on geology that Gertrude had finally been permitted to keep because it was, at this point, entirely hers. The children grew. The ranch grew. The years moved through Dust Creek with the particular speed of time that is fully occupied. Seasons of cattle and snow and spring mud and summer heat and fall roundup. Years of Wednesday evenings in the schoolroom with the lanterns burning and the hands working through their letters. Years of books and accounts and long conversations on the porch while the Colorado dark came down around them. In 1889, Cora went to Pueblo. In 1890, Bess married a young man from the town of Trinidad, a carpenter named George Ellison, who was steady and direct, and looked at Bess with an expression that told Gertrude everything she needed to know about his intentions and his character. Micah walked Bess down the aisle of a church in Trinidad with an expression on his face that Gertrude had seen only a few times before, entirely unguarded, and she took his hand when he returned to the pew beside her and held it through the rest of the ceremony. Samuel at 5 was attending his mother's school, which he found insufficiently exciting, and was waging a sustained campaign to be taught how to rope cattle instead. Gertrude taught him to rope cattle and continued the arithmetic, which she informed him were not mutually exclusive skills. He considered this and concluded that she had a point. Alina at 2 had not yet formed a strong opinion about arithmetic but had a great deal to say about horses. In the spring of 1891, Frances Aldworth came west to visit. She arrived on the Tuesday stage from Pueblo, which Gertrude met herself. And when she stepped off the stage and saw Gertrude standing in the street of Dust Creek, Colorado, she stopped and looked at her friend with the careful attention of a woman who has not seen someone in 8 years and is assessing whether they are well. What she saw was a woman who was 34 years old, lean and brown from sun and outdoor work, dressed practically but well, with her dark hair in a loose arrangement that would not have passed muster in Hartford and was entirely appropriate here. She saw a woman who stood in the street of a frontier town with the easy uprightness of someone who knows exactly where she is and intends to remain there. "You look entirely different," Frances said. "I look like myself," Gertrude said. "Perhaps for the first time." Frances looked at her for another long moment and then crossed the space between them and embraced her friend. And Gertrude felt the weight of the history between them, all of it, the good and the difficult and the years that had moved between them like a river that can be crossed in memory, even when it cannot be crossed in fact. "Come," Gertrude said. "Come and meet my husband and my children and the people I live among, and I will tell you everything I have been too busy to write." They walked to the wagon where Micah was waiting. Frances met him with the frank assessment of a woman who has a personal stake in whether he is what his wife believes him to be. And Micah received her assessment with his usual direct honesty. And by the time they reached the AA ranch, Frances had understood him well enough to say to Gertrude that evening, privately, in the blue and green room that was now full of more books and 2 children's drawings pinned to the wall, that she thought Gertrude had found something that most people spend their lives looking for and a great many never find. Yes, Gertrude said simply. "I know." Frances stayed 2 weeks and fell in love with the ranch and with Colorado, and with the particular community that had grown up around the Double A in the years since Gertrude's arrival. She spent an afternoon in the schoolroom watching Gertrude teach and was quiet afterward for a long time. "You were always the best of us," Frances said. "Hartford was too small for you." "Hartford was too interested in its own smallness for anyone," Gertrude said, which was fair. One evening near the end of Frances's visit, the 4 adults, Frances and Gertrude and Micah and Hector, sat on the front porch in the late spring night while Maria put the younger children to bed inside, and the conversation moved through the comfortable range of people who have no reason to perform for each other. Hector talked about the land, the legal battle resolved, the expansion of what his family considered their portion of the world in ways that were possible now, because they had fought for what was theirs. Frances talked about Hartford and the ways it had changed and the ways it had not, and said that Edmund Farr had moved to Boston after the bankruptcy and was not, by any report she had received, doing particularly well. Gertrude found that she felt nothing much about Edmund Farr. Not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. He had been a part of her story, and he had been wrong for her, and he had treated her badly, and the world had corrected the record, and he was, in the final accounting, a minor and diminishing figure in a narrative that had gone on to contain considerably more interesting things. "Are you satisfied?" Frances asked her late that night, the 2 women having stayed on the porch after the men went inside. "With what specifically?" Gertrude asked. "With everything," Frances said, "with how it all came out." Gertrude looked at the dark of the Colorado range, the stars above it, the lights of the house behind her where her children were sleeping, and her husband was likely reading something about land management or soil science or the territorial legislature's ongoing failure to address cattle grazing rights adequately. "Yes," she said. The word was complete and without qualification. "Entirely." Frances left on the Thursday stage, and Gertrude watched the stage until it rounded the bend and the dust settled. Micah was standing behind her. She turned and he was there, and she looked at him in the afternoon light of a Colorado spring, this man with his honest eyes and his economy of words and his 7-sentence letters and his wildflowers, and felt the fullness of the decade they had built together. "Frances approves of you," she said. "I know," he said. "She told me herself." "She told you." "This morning," he said, "when you were getting the stage ready. She said she wanted me to know that she had come here prepared to be disappointed and was not. She said you deserved someone who was not disappointed in you, and she was glad I was not." Gertrude blinked hard. "Frances is extremely direct." "She reminded me of someone," he said, and the smile was full and real. She took his hand and they walked back to the house together, and the spring air was warm and full of the smell of grass, and the distant sound of the cattle and the closer sound of Samuel, who was 5 years old and apparently conducting some kind of argument, with a fence post that he felt was in the wrong position, which was a very Samuel concern to have. The years that followed were the years of a life fully lived. In 1892, the Double A hosted its first community school meeting, at Gertrude's instigation, with families from across the county gathering to discuss the establishment of a proper district school that would serve not only the ranch children but all the children of the area. The meeting was contentious in the way that meetings about resources and fairness always are, and Gertrude ran it with the particular combination of patience and precision that had always been her strength. And by the end of it, there was a committee and a plan, and a provisional agreement from the county on a building. Hector Salinas served on the committee as treasurer, which was the correct decision both practically and symbolically, and Gertrude served as the educational director, and the Dust Creek District School opened in the fall of 1893 in a proper building with glass windows and 3 rooms, which was the most gratifying thing she had been part of that did not involve the birth of a child. Samuel Ashford, 7 years old and extremely strong in both arithmetic and cattle roping, attended the new school with the ambivalent relationship to formal education shared by all children who find the world more interesting than the classroom, and was managed with the expert application of the advanced mathematics his mother could offer at home to bridge the gap between his attention and the school's capacity. Micah Ashford, 4, was already reading and held the distinct opinion that her brother was loud. In 1894, a young woman arrived in Dust Creek on the Tuesday stage. Gertrude was in Corbett's store, which was now run by Corbett's son, when the young woman walked in. She was perhaps 22, wearing a traveling dress that had seen better days, carrying a single bag, and looking at the world with the expression of a person who is trying very hard not to look afraid. She asked Corbett's son, with a voice that was steady in the surface and shaking underneath, whether there was work to be had in Dust Creek. Gertrude set down the thread she had been examining. She thought of a Tuesday 11 years ago, in this store, sitting in a chair by the window waiting for a man she had not yet met, carrying a shame that did not belong to her. She crossed the store and introduced herself and asked the young woman her name. She said her name was Clara Jennings, and she had come from Kansas, and she said this with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned that information about their origin is best parceled out slowly. "What can you do?" Gertrude asked her. Clara Jennings listed things with the speed of a person who has been asked this question in a context where the answer was never enough, and Gertrude listened and catalogued and thought about the district school's need for a second teacher, which she had been pressing the committee about for 3 months. "I have a suggestion," Gertrude said, "if you have a few minutes." Clara Jennings had a few minutes. She wrote a letter to Micah that evening because the school committee decisions required his signature as the original sponsor, and she told him what she had found. He read the letter at the table, looked up and said, "If you think she is right for it, write the contract." She wrote the contract. Clara Jennings began teaching at the Dust Creek District School in the fall of 1894, and she was good at it, and she stayed in Dust Creek and built a life there. And if there was a story about Kansas that she had brought west with her, Gertrude never asked about it, and the town never made it any of their business. And that was the appropriate way to handle it. By 1895, the Double A Ranch was a 12-year-old enterprise, a working and profitable thing with a reputation in the county as a place of fair dealing. And Micah Ashford was 44, a little grayer at the temples and no less direct, and Gertrude Bell Ashford was 38, a little more settled into herself, a little more sure. One evening, in October of that year, they sat on the porch, which was their custom that had never changed across 12 years of marriage, and the fall was doing what Colorado fall does, burning the aspens on the far hills gold and red, and the air going crisp and clean with the specific smell of a season in the process of changing. Samuel was inside doing his mathematics with the intensity of a boy who has discovered that he is competitive and that arithmetic is something to be won. Eleanor was asleep, 9 years old and still the most watchful person in any room. Micah was reading. Gertrude was reading. The coffee was warm. "I am thinking about the spring curriculum," she said. "What about it?" he said. "I want to add natural philosophy, real natural philosophy with field work. There is a woman at the Denver College doing work on soil composition that is directly applicable to what you do with the range. I have been corresponding with her." He put down his book and looked at her. "You want to bring her out here?" "I want her to give a lecture at the school," she said, "and I want to suggest to Hector that they might consult on the water table issue in the North Pasture." Micah was quiet for a moment. "Write the letter," he said. "I already wrote it," she said. "I am waiting for a reply." He looked at her and then he smiled, the full, complete, real smile that was still, after 12 years, her favorite thing. "Of course you did," he said. She smiled back. The stars were beginning to come out over the eastern pasture, the same stars that had been there on the evening he told her he loved her, and she thought about the distance she had traveled from a chair in a general store in Hartford, where she was waiting to find out what happened next to this porch, this man, this life. The shame she had carried west had been someone else's. She had known that when she carried it, though knowing had not immediately dissolved the weight of it. But she had brought it here, to this ground, to this air, to a man who had read a letter 7 sentences long and understood something the rest of the world had missed, which was that a person's history is not a verdict. She reached over and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat in the cooling October evening while the stars came out above the Colorado range, and the cattle moved in the far pastures, and inside the house their children were beginning the particular quiet preparations of evening, and the life they had built was entirely solid around them. Entirely, completely, and permanently solid. She had come west carrying a shame she had not earned. She had found a cattleman who did not care about it. And what they had built from that meeting, from those 7 honest sentences and those wildflowers on a writing table, and a fence repaired in summer heat and a kiss that neither of them had planned, was a life that required no apology and held no secrets and belonged, without qualification, to both of them. The October stars over the double a ranch burned cold and clear above the Colorado plain, and the woman and the man who sat beneath them held hands in the dark, and the story that had begun in fear and shame and a borrowed sense of worthlessness had arrived, through the honest country of love, at the place where it was always supposed to end. Here, exactly here.